our team were developing remote sensing and analytics systems on the types of aircraft that you see on the bottom left here. A lot of people often think of these systems as not much more than eyes in the sky or a camera overhead, but there's a lot of relatively advanced systems on board here, gathering a lot of different types of intelligence on different applications. And the reason I bring this up, and I go through it in some details, because there's a lot of parallels between technology that have been developed for these types of platforms and the technologies that we're developing and applying to agricultural needs. In particular, what you'll find, though, is that between the defense space and the agriculture space, there's an immense diversity of information needs. And really, to serve those information needs, at the cornerstone of everything you do has got to be an accurate measurement that you can trust before you can really make any decisions based on that information. Before I go into the technology and any level of detail, I'll just give you a high-level picture on what it is we do. So we produce the intelligence systems for small drones. We don't produce the aircraft. We work with companies like DJI to put the systems on board those aircraft that everything from the time a photon hits the first lens of a camera to the point where you're delivering information to the agronomist, that's the chain of technology that we develop. So that incorporates a sensing side on the front end, which I'll get into in detail in a few minutes, and then all the analytics chain that takes that raw information from a camera and ultimately delivers the information to an end user. At a high level, this is how it works. Our systems are designed to really operate on any aircraft that can carry them. They have onboard GPS, onboard IMUs. They're what we call self-navigating sensor systems. Really, you just bolt them onto the aircraft, apply power, and they'll go off and collect data. So step one, automated surveys, and if you've worked with drones from companies like DJI, you know that they're getting better every day and they're really automated. Step two, results are delivered instantly at the conclusion of a flight in the field, really independently of where you may be operating. So there's no cloud upload. All the results are delivered immediately on site. After those initial results are collected, so initially the agronomist or the scout may look at that information and want to do some ground truthing on their own, but that data also can be pushed to their database on their whatever GIS system they may be running, and then ultimately all that data is aggregated on the client's GIS system, where they can really extract value at another secondary level here, which is looking at the data in context of other information that they may be collecting. So I'm going to shift, and that's kind of a high-level picture of what our products do and how they operate. What I want to do now is talk in detail about the technology, because our philosophy and our approach on how we develop this technology is a bit different. And to put that into context, I'm going to talk a little about some history here, and bear with me. I think you'll see the relevance to this point of the conversation. So people have been putting cameras on drones for quite a while, but it wasn't really until kind of the early 90s when it really started to gain really some level of traction. And at that point in time, it was really no more than a camera being put on a drone to provide an eye in the sky. And at the time, that was really in advance because you could have somebody on the other side of the world with a real-time video feed of what was happening on a battlefield, perhaps 12 time zones away. So from a remote sensing point of view, that's really no more than putting a camera on board a drone. What the real advances were, though, were the ability to operate an aircraft halfway around the world and get that information almost instantaneously. So there's a lot to this package. There's aspects of remote sensing, but there's a lot in the architecture and how you collect information and ultimately deliver that to a user. So this basic capability was introduced, and just a point of trivia, the first Predator systems, the U.S. wasn't even the first customer. Turkey actually was the first country to buy a Predator drone system. But through the 90s, it really was no more than a camera in the sky. Around the early 2000s are really when things started to change, and that's when we went from basic analog video cameras to digital imaging systems. So suddenly, rather than just a video feed, we are now collecting images in a digital form that we could analyze. We could start looking at pixel intensities, looking at shapes of objects in different image frames, and from that really start to extract different types of intelligence that had a lot more value. In this particular period of time, this is actually when our team was working at General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, so we had a lot of experience in the development of these types of systems. But as soon as we were able to start delivering digital imagery, our customers started asking for more specific types of information, not just the video in the sky. They started asking these types of questions. They said, can you find any disturbed Earth that may be out there? We want to find a trace chemical that may be scattered on the field. We want to see beneath a tree canopy. We want to be able to track a vehicle, or we want to even identify a person. These are the types of questions that were coming to companies like ours that we were working at. Once they realized that you could do more than just put a camera on a drone and take pictures, you can start answering specific questions like this. Suddenly there was an explosion in adoption of these types of aircraft systems. So part of the reason I make the point here is that I think we're approaching a similar time with commercial drones, particularly within agriculture, in that we're going from what we would say just a basic TV in the sky to more advanced types of information that have a lot more value, and that's going to really drive an explosive growth in adoption. So to carry this analogy, the way we view it, NDVI, I'm assuming if you're sitting in this room, you know what NDVI is. We view NDVI really as kind of the old analog eye in the sky. It's got its uses, but it's not really speaking to a lot of the specific information needs of people in agriculture. So the way we typically interact with our customers is the way we did when we were in the defense space, is we sit down with the customer and say, forget everything you know about technology or what your perceptions on it. Just tell us what you want to know about your fields. What don't you know now that you would like to know? And we get all sorts of answers. We have one relatively large customer who came to us and said, we want to track pineapple and banana growth. We've got operations on 4 continents, mostly in relatively remote locations, typically in the tropical to subtropical region, usually in areas where we don't have a lot of infrastructure for computing. But we want to track pineapple and banana growth, so how do we do that? So this is the type of problem we work on. But depending on who you talk to, it's just not by crop type or geography. There's just an immense different type of information needs, and these are the types of, and when we ask people, what would you like to know about your fields that you don't know today, these are the types of answers we get. We want to find irrigation leaks. We want to count wheat spikes. We're looking for bacterial infections. We want to count corn population. There's just a huge diversity of information needs in the agriculture space, and what we're trying to do is put together technology that answers some of these specific questions. Particularly with regard to technology adoption in this particular space, either in agriculture or in the defense space, information value drives adoption. So it's worth spending just a minute talking about what we mean by information value. And this is a framework we've been working with for quite a while. We define information value on 2 axes. One is actionability and the other is availability. So actionability means, can you take this piece of information and go make a decision and actually act on it that's going to affect some change in your operations. Availability means that information has to be at the time and the place and the cost that you need it in order to extract any sort of value from it. So we define information along these 2 axes. And once we do that, we can start mapping out where different information alternatives exist in this particular space, and then look for areas where we can improve. So just to begin mapping things out here, we define a line on these axes where we call the line of marginal value. If you're in the bottom left of that line, you don't really have a viable information solution. And where you want to go here is higher information availability and higher actionability. Move to the up and to the right. So to just begin framing this for you, we place human scouts down here. So a human scout can go out and survey a field and produce extremely actionable information, but they score low on the availability scale because human scouts are so sparse, they just can't cover all the land you need to cover. On the complete other end of the spectrum, you have satellite imagery, covering hundreds or thousands of square miles in an hour, but the utility of that information is relatively low. The actionability is low. So as far as information value go, we kind of view satellites and human scouts on a relatively equal basis in terms of value. And then you can map out other alternatives for how information is collected. So rewind a few years. before we started our company, we looked at this information value space and looked at the low altitude drone as something that's completely different from these alternatives, because it has the ability to move to the up and to the right on this chart where none of these other alternatives do. And so that's really what we focus on, is exploiting the value of the low altitude drone. I'm going to go into in just a minute what I mean by that, but it really incorporates using computer vision and some machine learning techniques to extract more useful information out of imagery than just NDVI type imagery. And then doing that on a distributed edge node computing basis, which allows you to scale it and really operate this anywhere in the world, so the availability is high. So that's really what we focus on. One other topic I'm going to come back to a couple times through the talk is that we see a lot about satellite imagery and manned aircraft systems. We have a firm belief, and I think I'll touch on this throughout the talk, that manned aircraft really have no hope against the low altitude drone in terms of information delivery in the long term. And I'm going to touch on that in a couple places through the talk. So part one on why drones win is something we call the Johnson criteria. And bear with me for a second on this, but back in the early days of aerial remote sensing, what we call, the early days for us, we consider the 1950s. Back then, they were trying to design imaging systems to address certain needs, so certain information needs. So we need to be able to detect a vehicle. What type of resolution do we need from an imaging system to do that particular task? And they did a lot of analysis, and this was mostly, I think the US Army did a lot of this initial analysis, but they said, look, in order to detect something, back then they called them line pairs, an old analog imaging system, now we call them pixels, but they said you need to put at least a pixel on an object to detect that it's there. Now, in this particular case, you see these white blocks. These are 3 different objects, but they all look the same. There's only 1 pixel and across a small dimension on these things. And looking at it, you don't know what it is. You can tell there's something there. And in fact, the 3 of them look very similar. But if you put higher resolution on this particular object, you can move to a new step of information, which is called recognition. And in this particular case, using that exact same imagery at higher resolution, in the top case you can say, well, this is actually a person. The second case, you can tell it's a vehicle. In the bottom one, you can tell that it's a boat. So just applying higher resolution, it's not just an incremental increase in what you can do with the information. You've actually gone from being able to detect something is there to recognizing what it is. That makes a big difference. Take this another step further. You put more pixels on that target. Now you can go beyond saying this is just a person, but you can actually start making out that this person's carrying a weapon. So this is actually a soldier. In the middle case, this is a Humvee, and in the bottom, this is an inflatable boat. So the point here is that putting more resolution on a target, more pixels on a target, doesn't just provide a more image clarity. It allows you to make decisions that are markedly different, moving from detection to recognition to identification. So this was back in the 50s that the US Army started doing classifying their imaging systems according to this Johnson criteria. So I bring this whole thing up because it applies directly to what we're doing today in agriculture. This is 1 pixel of an agriculture. This happens to be a cornfield, but this is 1 pixel from a satellite image on a resolution of about 1 meter. This is a manned aircraft of the same area at 25 centimeter resolution, and this is what you can do with a low altitude drone. Now, I'm going to dig into this in a bit more detail because you can extract very different information from these different image types based on the resolution here. And back to the point about why low altitude drones are always going to beat satellites and manned aircraft, it really comes down to this particular criteria that when you can begin putting resolution down on plants that are smaller than the leaves on the plants, you are entering a space of completely different types of information that you can create. These 2 images on the left that you can see, they're kind of a greenish, grayish tint to them. What's happening in those particular images is something we call spectral mixing. So you can see from the image on the right, you have soils, you have weeds, you've got shadows, specular reflections, and then there's the green plant matter that we all recognize. The 2 images on the left are mixing all that information into the pixels, so you just kind of get a greenish gray type of appearance. But with a low altitude drone, you can spatially separate that information. I'll come back to this in a minute. So to start talking about what we call spectral imaging, I want to introduce this topic first by making a distinction between photography and remote sensing. So photography really is just measuring the number of photons that come off of some target, some object that may be in the field. Whereas remote sensing, we're using what we know in physics about how photons interact with matter to make to learn about the characteristics of that particular matter. In the case of in observing plants with imaging systems, with reflected sunlight, you can do the photography aspect, which is you can measure how much light is coming off that plant canopy, and you can bucket it by different parts of the spectrum here and say there's more green light or more near infrared light coming off the plant, and you can try to make some estimates on what that means about the plant health. But what we're not trying to just do photography, we're trying to do remote sensing. What we really care about is not how much light came off of that plant. We want to know how much light was absorbed by the plant, because that tells us about what types of pigments are present in the leaves. It tells us a little bit about the cellular structure of the plant. So I make this important distinction because if you're just doing the photography aspect and just measuring the reflected sunlight piece, you don't get that part. You really need to know what struck the plant on the other side to know what was absorbed by it. And when you can measure what was absorbed by the plant, then you can start making some estimated guesses on pigment concentrations and cellular structure of the plant. And that's the information that really is useful in determining plant health. So this particular technique, in terms of accurately characterizing sunlight and then looking at how that sunlight was absorbed by the plant canopy and reflected back to your sensor, that concept's been around for a long time, decades, back to the early 70s. They started using this technique on satellites in the early 70s. But from a satellite, they know, and the sunlight is extremely well characterized. And the problem for satellites is they need to know what the atmosphere did. How did the atmosphere change that sunlight before it hit the plant? And that's really just an educated guess. There's different particulate matter in the atmosphere, so there's a lot of advanced techniques that have gone into trying to model the atmospheric characteristics so a satellite system can make an estimated guess on what type of light has been absorbed by the plant canopy. A low-altitude drone operating at a 100 meters altitude doesn't have that problem. All that atmosphere is mostly above you, and you're really just above the plant canopy. But you have a different problem. You need to know what the characteristics of that sunlight was before it struck the plant to make any estimated guesses on what actually happened within the plant. Now, the traditional technique in low-altitude remote sensing like this is to put a calibration target out in the side of the field, typically a white or a gray panel, and you'll image that with your system and then image the plants. And by imaging something of a known reflectance, you can characterize what the sunlight conditions were and then go image the rest of the crop and apply that lesson. But if you think forward, and in the not too distant future when we have beyond line of sight drone operations, it's not going to be feasible to just go put down a calibrated reflectance panel everywhere you might want to do your operations. So you really want to do it all on board the aircraft. And even more importantly, every image, every frame that you collect with your measurement system needs to be corrected, because clouds will pass during your collections that will change your results. So this is several years ago now, we developed this basic technique to put solar irradiance spectrometry on top of the aircraft. What this basically boils down to is the ability to make accurate measurements for every frame that's collected by the system throughout the course of the flight. So anyway, we developed this several years ago. We had a U.S. patent awarded on this about a year ago. We have since, just actually about 2 weeks ago, had a second patent awarded on this particular technique that we believe is fundamental to how you're going to deploy remote sensing technologies on drones, especially in beyond line of sight operations where you just don't have the ability to put reflectance panels down. And just to kind of summarize on this particular topic, if anybody suggests that you don't need to do the left half of this measurement, that's really it's photography, as I said. You can't really make estimated or accurate measures of what's going on inside the plant without the left side of that measurement. And I think if you look across the industry space, when you see people using reflectance panels, they understand the importance of doing this type of measurement. So I'm staying on the topic of information accuracy here, and back to my three favorite pictures. Accuracy involves more than just doing the calibrated measurement that I had on the last slide. Accuracy also means only measuring the part of the signal that's of importance to you. So, as I mentioned on the earlier slide, in this particular image, we can separate specular reflections. That's sunlight that just bounced off the waxy surface of a plant that doesn't really carry information about the health of the plant. There's weeds, there's shadows, there's soils. What you care about is the photon that got inside of that plant cell, interacted with the cell, and then came back up to your camera. That's the information that's actually useful. But all this other stuff is what we consider noise. Now, the advantage of the low-altitude drone compared to the satellite and the manned aircraft is because our resolution is high, we can spatially filter all that information out that's not of use to us and just focus on the signature that's coming off the plant leaves. And that does a couple of things for us. One, it makes it a far more accurate measurement because we're only measuring the pixels that interacted at the cellular level with the plant. It makes it far more sensitive because you're not doing a spectral mixing that you've got in the top on the top left two there. And it's got another downstream benefit too, which gets into image compression. I'll come back to that in a minute. But one additional point I want to make on this slide is that the people that developed the satellite systems understood this problem of spectral mixing. And they developed techniques. In particular, there's a vegetation index called the Soil-Adjusted Vegetation Index. What that was originally developed to do is to try to unmix the information here so that take the gray out of that grayish-greenish tint that you have in that image. So you can just concentrate on the plant matter. Now, what we've seen a bit in the industry space is people applying this soil-adjusted vegetation index to drone imagery, which in our opinion kind of destroys the point of the drone in the first place. If you can collect imagery at this resolution, you can spatially filter out that noise and not have to apply an index that was never developed for this in the first place. Okay, so after talking a bit about the technology, I'm going to talk about some specific examples on how do you go use this type of information. So this is a more or less just kind of a basic example. This is a Brazilian cornfield, and there's a color image from a satellite. There's an NDVI image there, and if you look at these two images, and I'm just concentrating on the lower right quarter of this circle, you look at that NDVI imagery and the color image, and you go, well, it looks pretty uniform, looks pretty good health, and you move on. But a low-altitude drone, using some of the techniques I just mentioned, on the bottom left is what we call vegetation stress. So vegetation stress, NDVI is looking at 2 spectral channels. This uses 4, so it's kind of a quad band NDVI. But when you separate out the background soils and all those things like that, and just concentrates on the vegetation matter, you can start seeing some variability in plant health across the field that's not apparent if you just look at the color image or the NDVI. Furthermore, when you separate the plant matter from the background soils, you can produce a product that we call vegetation fraction, which is the ratio of growing plant matter to background soils. And this is really looking at biomass in the field. So when you compare the biomass and the amount of stress in the plants, you're really getting to a better picture on what yield potential looks like. And if you look at this data, you see there's actually a substantial amount of variability across the field that's not apparent at all from the NDVI or color image that are collected at higher altitudes. And the reason is the processing techniques that are enabled by high-resolution, low-altitude drone systems are really what enables that deeper level of insight. This is another example. Back to the point earlier I made about when we meet with customers, the first thing we say is, well, what do you want to know about your fields that you don't know today? And when we first got started, we're based in San Diego, but from a farming point of view, we really started in southeast Nebraska, southwest Iowa, primarily in irrigated corn and soybean fields. The first thing they said to us, can you give us a plant count at emergence? So this is just a color image here. So we developed some software, again, back to these same techniques on the ability to segregate background soils and other detritus that may be in the field from growing plant matter, and just highlight those growing plants. So I'll do that one more time. Just a color image to showing where all the individual plant detections are. So once you can detect the individual plants, you can do a couple of things now. Well, first you can count them, which is relatively easy to do, but you can also measure their size. I mean, just with your eye, you can tell that some of these plants are larger than others. In this particular case, actually, there's the pivot track that you can see in this particular field. Just under the first sprayer inside of that pivot track wheel, all those plants were smaller. And the interesting thing here was that the population was pretty close to the same, but the plants were substantially smaller just under that one sprayer on that pivot track. So then using that data, we can create a map. And this is not an image like an NDVI image. This is actually a statistical representation of the number of plants per acre that are in this field. And as I was just mentioning, you can see the circular pattern here inside that pivot track where in some spots it looks like there's a lower population. Then you can look at plant size. So this is substantially different information where in terms of the population map on the left, it's relatively uniform. There's some features in there. But when you look at plant size, there's actually a lot of correlation with the planting direction. So it's another level of information that you're not getting by just looking at population. And then once you've segregated all those plants out, you can actually go and start doing things like looking at the chlorophyll index. So to talk about higher end farming operations, particularly in plant breeding, this is just one plot of several thousand in a particular test plot area. So this is one plot developing over the course of the season. This is just a color image, and you can, the top image you can't really even see what's going on there, but the first step in the analysis here is to separate growing vegetation from all that background material. But ultimately what the people in the breeding programs are interested in is not a picture of this. What they're interested in is just this data. So through the course of the season from emergence, and the bottom image is tasseling, what we're doing is initially measuring the plant population, measuring plant size, and then at specific stages of growth throughout the season, measuring the vegetation fraction, measuring the chlorophyll index. And ultimately, the customer just gets delivered a table of information. They really don't have any use for the imagery. And from our point of view, back to the earlier analogy we were making about just putting a camera in the sky to take pictures, I think we're moving beyond that to the point where now we're delivering statistical information on individual plots. So this is just one plot. And like I said, there were several thousand in this particular field. And ultimately what we do is we aggregate all the results from all these individual plots, and then our customer will take that and correlate that to the agronomic or the genetic characteristics of all those individual plots. So back to plant population. It's relatively easy to count plants that are all in a nice clean field of bare soil, but that's very rarely the case in the real world. So this is actually an example from a lettuce field in California. And the grower in this particular case, of course this is all harvested by hand. It's a very expensive operation to go harvest the field. He knew he had a terrible weed problem, and he had a relatively low population. The decision he was trying to make is it worth the money to pay the crews to go out and harvest this field? Is there enough lettuce out there to pay off just the labor in doing the collections? So the difficulty here, and you can, this is one high-resolution color image on the right, and then I have a blown-up portion on the left. There's different types of plants in that field. And if you want to do a population, you can't count every plant. You'd want to count just the lettuce heads. That's what he cares about. So from an engineering point of view, this actually gets quite challenging in terms of not only how do you count individual plants, but only count the ones that belong to the class that you're interested in. So what we've done in taking that population tool that we originally developed for corn fields, modified it to work in these lettuce fields. And in this particular case, the lettuce heads are identified in green and the weeds are in red. So just go back again. Now that you have this information, we can create our plant population map, which again, this is just the population of lettuce heads, but we can also look at the size of the individual lettuce heads. And ultimately, in this particular case, the data said it's not worth harvesting this field, and they just let it go. another relatively complex problem back to our banana and pineapple customer. In this particular case, when we sat down with them and they said, what we want to do is count pineapples and measure their size. Now this one gets really complex because you're just looking for the fruit that's in the crown portion of this plant, and it's extremely dense plant growth, and how do you find that fruit growing in the middle of the plant? It gets much more complex. But anyway, we adapted our existing algorithms that we developed in corn and some specialty vegetable crops in California, and now are basically measuring the size and the count of pineapple fruit. And that's what the map here is. So this was an interesting case study. This was actually one of our customers who's a relatively small corn, soybean, and sugar beet grower in Minnesota. What he wanted to do was try to quantify on a per acre basis what's the actual return in dollars on using and applying the type of information from these systems. We always make the point that the information that we can deliver from an aerial system, I think, is valuable, and it's information that you can't really collect in any other manner, but it's not by itself everything you need to make important decisions for a farm. In his particular case, what he did is surveyed his field with our system, and this happens to be just our vegetation stress map. And like NDVI, you know, I guess green is good, red is bad. But he also did soil sampling here using the Yield Center 360 soil scanner. But combining the aerial measurements with his soil chemistry measurements, he's able to produce a prescription map and just meter out nitrogen application. But he did it in two ways, not just spatially varying nitrogen application, but he actually temporally varied the application. So he only would apply, he was able to apply, I can't remember what stage of growth, but rather than apply all up front, he was able to apply into the season, and that saved him some risk on weather events. But ultimately, at the end of the season, he went back and he tried to quantify on a per acre basis what was the value of this practice. And what he came up with, reduced nitrogen input was about $10 an acre, but the boost in yield was about 20. So his estimate, and this is just a relatively small corn farm in Minnesota, the value of this particular technology and practice to him was about $30 per acre. The part that he didn't quantify is next year he's going to plant sugar beets in this field. And residual nitrogen is problematic for sugar beet growth. And he said the ability to minimize the amount of residual nitrogen in the soil for next year is going to benefit his sugar beet crop. And that's something he has not been able to quantify, and he just called that icing on the cake. So I've provided some background technology on our remote sensing side and the types of information products that we can deliver with it. There's another half to this, and I've been talking about so far information actionability, back to that information value chart that I had earlier. What I want to do now is talk about the availability side, and back to the point of that predator drone that's operating 12 time zones away. There's a real problem, and how do you get the information to the person, the decision maker, when they need it, when the information is still valuable. So back to our banana and pineapple grower customer. They want to create a global dashboard of their production operations from their offices in Miami. They've got operations in Costa Rica, Kenya, the Philippines, United States. How do you put together a drone sensing system that's actually going to get data into a dashboard in Miami quickly? If you look at the volumes of data here involved, look at Costa Rica, for example. If you look at the amount of acreage that they have, the program that they set up for what types of data collections they want to do, it's about 3 terabytes a day of raw data. They estimate about 4 megabits per second on average to their operations center. So how do you deal with 3 terabytes a day being collected in Costa Rica and get that into a database for viewing in Miami within a day? You can create valuable new types of information, but if you can't get that to the place it's needed at the time it's needed, it doesn't have any value. So what we have to do is architect these systems to move the information in a way that's consumable. And the approach that we've taken is to process the data in the field and then upload the statistical high-level information and basically throttle the amount of data that gets into that database based on the amount of bandwidth that we have to that database. So in the United States, where they've got 100 megabit per second, maybe we can pull all that raw data into their database. But from the Philippines, they have to restrict it to relatively high-level summary statistics. But the point is that deploying a fleet of systems like this requires some flexibility in how you manage your data flows. So in terms of managing data flows, the first thing you want to do is try to reduce the volume of raw data you're collecting. And this, I've got a couple of sample images here. Again, this is the 2 rows of corn that I've been using all along. Typically, the first step that many take in this particular process is to compress the imagery. You get 10, 20x reduction in your raw data volume by compressing your imagery, but you're destroying the value of the information in the process. So traditional image processing techniques indiscriminately will compress the imagery of the leaves, the soils, and all that background information. And then back to the point, what's the value of a low altitude drone? It's that resolution you can use to extract more valuable information. If you compress the imagery at the first step, you've lost that ability. And now you're back to the point, well, what was the point of the drone in the first place? You might as well just use the manned aircraft where you can get more area coverage, because you're not going to extract any useful information out of compressed imagery. So the technique that we developed that's a bit different, and I alluded to this earlier, is that when you can separate spatially the different types of information that are in an image, you can selectively compress them differently. And what we basically do here is all those photons that didn't actually interact with the plant material, we compress them down to 0. And just keep those pixels that actually contain relevant information. And between the 2 images on the top and the bottom, you get about the same compression rate. So the top right, it may be hard to see from where you're sitting, but you've really lost the resolution in that image. But on the bottom right, you've maintained it. And this technique has done a couple of things for us. Not only does it compress the imagery, it amplifies our signal-to-noise ratio, so it makes the measurements more sensitive. And there's other downstream effects that make it easier to stitch imagery. Some of the byproducts of this process make imagery easier to stitch together, which allows us to get by with lower overlap, and I'll show you that in a second. So traditional drone survey techniques require 70 to 80% overlap when you're collecting your imagery. Most use a spatial image correlation technique. It's the same thing that's in the panorama function on your phone. And it's looking for features in each individual image and trying to figure out how to put them together. In agricultural crops, that doesn't work very well because every image looks so similar to the image next to it, especially in row crops. Every plant looks so similar, it's really hard to find where exactly they fit together, and that's why you need 70, 80% overlap. So what that means, though, is that when you're doing your data collections, if every new image you collect only gives you 20% new information, you're collecting a lot of redundant data. On top of that, it takes a long time. So the compression technique that I just showed you produces some byproduct information that allows us to stitch the imagery together with a much lower overlap, and that we get by with about 20%. And this does a couple of things. One, going from 80% to 20% overlap extends by a factor of 4 the amount of area you can cover with your drone in one flight. Put another way, you can survey a field in 1/4 the time it would require using the other processing technique. So there's a lot of work going in. How do you make a drone get longer endurance? People want to use fixed wing systems because they get more area coverage over quadcopter or copter-based systems. But rather than spending a lot of energy trying to get more efficient batteries, more efficient aerodynamics, if you just process your data differently, you can extend the area coverage of your system by about 4x. On the data side, the raw data volume actually goes down by the square of that, which is 16x. So between the compression technique I had on the previous slide and the lower overlap requirements, your raw data volumes go down by a factor of 16. And once you get to that point, now you can start processing data on relatively low-powered processors and doing it in the field and doing it anywhere. And that makes the whole system scalable. And if you want to go survey, 10,000 hectares in the Philippines, you can do that relatively easily. Just to kind of summarize on this point here, this a couple of charts that we found really early on actually before we started the company. We looked at a map of where the world's agricultural lands are, and then put next to it a map of where the world's computing accessibility is. If you look at this at a finer, more granular scale, what you quickly see is that there's no computing power where there's farming. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, all the computing power is in urban centers. But looking at these maps, that basically told us from day one, if you want to go apply some high-resolution imaging and some advanced analytics techniques, and you want to scale this on a global basis across all the world's agricultural lands, you got to put the processing where the plants are being grown. So that our whole approach has been put the processing in the sensor and at least distribute how your processing is done based on how much capacity your network may have. And when you do that, the size of the market is completely different. Now, if you're in the drone services business, this one actually will make a big difference to you. If you're completely constrained to a cloud analytics processing technique, if you take that map of computing accessibility and match it up with the world's agricultural lands, you find, running through some numbers, you get about 100 million acres worldwide of market size. But if you put the processing where the plants are being grown, you can access all the world's agricultural lands. When you can include permanent crops, annual crops and things like even pasture lands, it's about 5.5 billion acres. So there's a 25x difference in market size available to you depending on how you're doing your processing. So ultimately what we're trying to do is not just provide, part of what we're doing is providing a picture of what's happening in a field so an agronomist or a scout can go take action. But what we want to do is start presenting dashboards of how operations are developing across large farming operations. So this is just sample data. You can see the number of fields. There's a few hundred fields in this particular sample, but you can start aggregating this information and seeing how different fields are developing. You have a real, a high-level picture on how farming operations are progressing. There's one last sample that I wanted to show, and this is a really unique benefit of kind of combining what I've been saying about advanced kind of remote sensing and analytics techniques combined with an edge processing approach. This is a pineapple field in Costa Rica. This is a map of vegetation fraction, which again is looking at the ratio of growing vegetation to bare soil, and that tells us about the biomass. If you look at all these individual blocks in this field, the vegetation fraction is relatively similar. If you look at a map of the chlorophyll index, you actually see there's a lot of variability in health across these different blocks. Now the question is, what's happening in these blocks? Is it something treatable? What we did is developed a technique which allows the user in the field to identify a particular signal or pattern. So in this particular case, in the bottom right portion of the image, you can kind of see some highlighted reddish orange. What we did is the agronomist went out. So there was a particular pathogen present in this particular part of the field which was causing the plants to lodge. And what we developed was the technique for the user at the system to basically sample that in the imagery and train the software to identify that particular signature. And what we've done here, rather than just having a picture of what the chlorophyll index is, just saying, there's many parts of the field that aren't very healthy, but this particular part of the field isn't healthy for a specific reason. So he identified that particular pathogen and can detect where it's occurring in this part of the field. And in the bottom right, it's a little bit hard to see, but the blue overlay is where our software is picking up that particular signature. And it's a combination of the color of the plants are slightly different, but they're withering in a certain way as well. So we're looking at both the spatial patterns and the color of the plants to identify this particular signature. Now the point here that's really valuable is not just to say that we can separate this particular health condition from others, but back to their global operations, we can push that signature out across the network. So it's relatively small. The spatial and the spectral characteristics of that particular condition push it out to their operations, push it from Costa Rica to the Philippines to Kenya to the US. And their systems that are operating in different locations can look for that similar condition. And over time, what you build is a library of different signatures and patterns that are emerging in fields that their agronomists are identifying, and they can search all their fields. They can go to historical data and research historical data for where these patterns are emerging. And even more importantly, it's a growing database of really what the agronomist is looking for in his fields. I'm going to come back to manned aircraft for one more second on the topic on why drones win part 2. So I dug up all this data on where the world's airports are located. And if you run through a bunch of numbers, how much does it cost to run a Cessna 182 class aircraft, pay a pilot, all these things, what you'll find is that to make it economically viable, you kind of have to be within about 50 kilometers of an airport. The United States is great for that. We have a higher density of airports in the U.S. than any other country in the world. There's a whole reason for that going back to World War II, but the data down here, what you see, the land area of the country per airport for the U.S. is about 250 square miles per airport. But if you look at some of the other leading agricultural companies or countries in the world, they have nowhere near the density of airports that we have available in the United States. So as far as trying to scale an enterprise operation for agricultural surveys, you're not going to get much beyond the United States if you're based on manned aircraft. And not to mention the cost of operating light aircraft is substantially lower in the U.S. than it is in overseas locations. So for manned aircraft-based operations, even to take off, you need to have a certain number of acres under contract to make it an economically viable flight. And if you go outside the United States where fuel prices are substantially higher, where there's a lot of government taxes and fees, the number of acres that you need to cover to make it an economically viable business begin falling apart. And so potentially a good thing if you live within reasonable distance of an airport, but not really scalable on a worldwide basis. Going back to my other point about the types of information you can create with low altitude drones, these two reasons are why manned aircraft are not going to really scale on a global basis for agricultural surveys. So just a couple more slides. I've been talking about agriculture all through here, but the technology that we've developed can be used in lots of other applications as well. So BNSF was kind enough to share some data. They're using our systems to look at vegetation health and obstruction of visual paths along railroad lines. This happens to be railroads, but has equal application for other infrastructure surveys, so typically power lines, looking for condition of vegetation health along these long corridors, as well as where vegetation may be obstructing visual lines of sight. Another common one, this is probably not too surprising, is just environmental surveys. So this happens to be, they're surveying some lagoons in Southern California. They sent scuba divers out looking for this grass that emerges in the lagoons, and it has tax benefits if the energy company can show that the eelgrass is growing properly. Replacing an extremely expensive manual survey operation with a drone flight, we can basically just replace that entire process of doing the scuba diving surveys. So anyway, my final slide here, just to kind of wrap this all up, is back to our actual product and what we're doing. Sensing systems and the analytics tool chains to really try to address more specific information needs for agriculture. General specs on our systems, and what we really concentrate on here are the information layers. So what we are constantly doing is developing new information layers based on the needs of customers as they come to us. And in most cases, that's taking an existing technique that we already have and just applying it to new applications, maybe doing some adaptation. But and what our systems, as it turns out, DJI platforms, probably 80% of our customers are on DJI platforms. Typically the Matrice series 100, 200, 600 are all shown up here. So.